Yeah, so settling into it a little bit, we're talking about monkeypox tonight, which I recognize is not the funnest conversation in the world. Ben, I'm hoping you can offer a little bit of comfort and information because if I'm being completely honest, I have really kind of strayed away from getting too into the weeds on this topic. You know, after having to deal with the Attorney General of Texas trying to turn all child affirming care into child abuse, followed by all of the stream of legislation limiting women's rights here in this state, it's gotten really unfun to talk about current events on this show. And so we've been maybe a little bit derelict in our duties. And I think it's important that we actually do take a moment and acknowledge this like pretty significant issue that's coming up. How concerned should we really be about this growing threat?
Yeah, so I know people are very exhausted with coming off of, I mean, we're not even off of COVID yet. We're
Yeah.
just now getting things open again, and there's still the threat of COVID looming over us. Our hospital still is saying COVID, but monkeypox, just based on its mechanism and kind of the disease that it is, it's both better and worse in terms of spread and in fatalities. So I think as long as people are being proactive and taking steps to prevent spread and also taking steps to uh, protect other people, then this shouldn't be as, hopefully, knock on wood here, not as scary as the COVID pandemic, but still definitely not something to take lightly.
Yeah, man.
And I
I mean,
can,
even if you're saying it's not as scary, just comparing anything to COVID does not
mhm,
feel great right now. Like two
definitely.
pandemics in this economy, I don't mean to overstate it, but there's a real hesitancy, I think, from a lot of people to get involved and to take this seriously right now.
Oh, definitely, and I can see that, and something like this, where it does become more of a problem for people, namely with going to work and going about their everyday lives, where COVID people are worried enough about staying home for 1 to 2 weeks, and even as things were shortened to, like, what, between 5 and 7 days, people were still not wanting to isolate, but something
Mhm.
with monkeypox, we're seeing an incubation period of, on average, around 7 to 14 days, with the highest being around 21 days just for incubation. So just knowing whether or not you have the infection at all. And then after that, once you start getting symptomatic, we're looking at 3 to 4 weeks of still being contagious before the disease goes away. So we're looking at a good month and a half to 2 months of quarantine to keep yourself safe. So while it doesn't seem to be as um, infectious as COVID-19, it definitely can be worse for people who need to go about their lives. So definitely reasons to stay conscious of what's happening and to not, you know, uh, abandon our guard for this kind of thing.
Sure, bear our head in the sand. I mean,
Can I just cut in real
yeah,
quick?
please.
Like, is a person contagious during that incubation period?
I believe so. It's going to be slightly different because obviously, if you're not having open lesions, that isn't a specific transmission source.
Right.
But and we'll get into this later because the methods of transmission relate to kind of the concerns socially that we have.
Right.
Um, but we do get rid of that one specific source, but otherwise. Uh, it's still it's still not wise to be going out if you know you've been exposed, unless you've been evaluated and given
Right.
prophylaxis.
That's a pretty long incubation period on the spectrum of incubation periods, is it not? It sounds
Oh yeah,
long.
yeah, it's long. It's a long period.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, already a lot of what you're saying feels like it's bumping up against what I feel like I thought I understood from the news radio and from, other articles that I have taken a look at, which, we're going to talk about misinformation and the problem that that poses in 2022 a little bit later. But for now, what is it that we actually do know about how this disease works? Because at least from the outside, it feels like the experts are a little bit confused. Is that at all a valid perception?
No, so we've had monkeypox viruses long before. We even had an outbreak in 2003 in the United States, but it was first identified in 1958 in, I believe, Denmark. But it's I guess I'll kind of give a Cliff's Notes version of the biology of this, but
Please.
it's a pox virus, so it's related to smallpox, but works slightly differently. So
Mhm.
it's a double-stranded DNA virus, meaning that it has to go into the cell and then it needs to be translated to proteins using the cell machinery. So it can't do that on its own. It's going to inject the DNA, that's going to be translated to proteins, and then that's going to cause the disease. So once this enters the cell, it's going to replicate. You're going to get all of this viral DNA and RNA and proteins being produced. And then that's going to leave. You're going to get what's called a primary viremia, where the virus is going to go to the lymph nodes. It's going to replicate there. And then you get a secondary viremia where it's going to leave the lymph nodes and then travel to other tissues. So kind of this incubation period, we're really looking at this primary viremia. And then as we're getting symptomatic, that's kind of more the secondary viremia stage. So I think understanding, at least for the audience, understanding how this virus moves through the body can kind of help us uh, understand more about how this disease works. So after it starts spreading throughout the body to these different tissues, that's when you start getting these skin lesions. Medically, we'd call them papules. They look a lot. If you've seen pictures of smallpox or chickenpox, those are some differentials that you'd see. So if you happen to notice these kinds of blisters on your skin, it might not necessarily be monkeypox. It could be chickenpox. It could be something like syphilis. It could be eczema. It could be herpes. Other types of diseases could look very similar, but you're going to get these blisters that are going to take their time to get bigger and then kind of crust over and then fall off. So that's what happens within that kind of 3 to 4 week period afterwards. Is these lesions are going to appear and then kind of get worse for a little bit and then go away. So I hope that was not too confusing and at least a little bit helpful on what this disease looks like.
No, I feel like I'm still following you, but can you walk us through a little bit what people's experiences are like? I mean, you're describing
Yeah,
2 or 3
yeah.
weeks of these lesions. What's the
Mhm.
maybe like the range of experiences and that prognosis like?
Yeah, so at least people that I know of who are specifically in the medical field that have contracted monkeypox, they say that these blisters are very painful, and a lot of them are getting them in, like, you'll get them in your mouth first, or you'll get them in your genital regions, and it's very painful, especially in those areas. Um, so that's kind of the biggest complaint there, is how painful those are. But
Hmm.
some other kind of complications that you can get from this is, of course, um, with any type of viral infection, your likelihood of getting a bacterial infection is going to increase, especially now that you have these open wounds all over your body. So you get this virus in, and then your immune system is going to work to try to combat it. So you become a little bit immunocompromised for a bit, and then that allows for certain bacteria to then uh, replicate further, and you get a second infection on top of it. Or if you get something in these open wounds, if you get some other staph or something in there, then you can get some super infections. You can also get sepsis. Of course, that's a risk with any infection.
Hmm.
Um, those are kind of the main concerns, but I mean, certain cosmetic things, you're possibly looking at scarring, from these lesions. And those are kind of the main things. As far as the prognosis of this disease, there are kind of two varieties of monkeypox, and there's the West African clade and the Central Basin or the Central Congo clade. And one of them is more lethal than the other. I think the Central African clade has a fatality rate of about 11% in the unvaccinated. The West African has a fatality rate below 1%. But I think the more lethal one is the more common one that we see in outbreaks, because the West African clade is less likely to spread amongst humans. But I can't confirm that for sure, like if whichever one someone were to have.
Sure. Well, as I understand it, here in Texas, actually, we had the first death here in the States from this outbreak. That's not a particularly common experience, but it's certainly a danger. Is that all fair to say?
It's a danger, yes. And typically in people that are immunocompromised or have other comorbidities where they're not as likely to fight off said infection are going to be at highest risk. For the most part, people are able to recover. Granted, it's a horrendous month or so of this symptomatic infection, but after those 4 weeks, most people do very well.
Yeah. Well, part of my hesitation in the past about discussing this on air is that there seems to be a fair bit of like contradiction or confusion, particularly around transmission. What do we know so far?
Yeah. So I know that we're going to be talking about the prevalence among the LGBTQ community, and I know that especially on this kind of show, that's where we're going to be taking it. But it is primarily transmissible through direct contact with lesions, and also through contact with fomites or anything that if you have open lesions and you're touching a table or you're touching a book and someone else is touching that, you can primarily get infection that way. You can also get it. It's not necessarily airborne, but if you're in a hospital room with someone who just had monkeypox, they got discharged, and now you have to clean their sheets off the bed. If you were to take the sheets and I don't know, get all the dust in the air, then you could get it in your lungs and you could get pneumonia. So really any contact with this virus is how you're going to get it. Primarily, it's going to be through skin-to-skin contact, which, of course, people love to label this as an STI or sexually transmitted infection. But if you think about it, sex is primarily touch. Oftentimes when people are engaging in sexual activity, they are touching each other.
So some of the mixed messaging that we're seeing from, the Center for Disease Control and like other public authorities, that's the point of confusion is, sex involves touching, but so does touching.
So does touching, yeah. So if I were to touch somebody on the shoulder and they had an open wound on their shoulder, I'm just as likely to get it as somebody who is having, sex. So, I mean, there's a lot of mixed messages, and it definitely gives a problematic stigma to the disease itself, but it can end up turning into almost a witch hunt for these people who have it, because if you see, well, this is a gay disease or this is a sexually transmitted disease, and you see a child that has this, or you see somebody else that has this who says that they're not sexually active, you can start to draw conclusions in your own mind about what happened, but that might not be the case. And so not only are you socially stigmatizing people, but you're also potentially denying them care, because like this person can't have monkeypox because they didn't have sex.
Right.
So they might be denied treatment, or they might be denied a vaccine or denied prophylaxis. And we're seeing that in terms of the vaccine, they're primarily marketing it to the LGBT community, especially men who have sex with men. But anyone that is at risk, if you are around somebody that may have been exposed, and you get the vaccine within 4 days of exposure, you might not even contract the disease at all. Or if you get it within, let me confirm the time frame on the vaccine because I just had it pulled up. I think it's within 14 days after having exposure. you might still get the disease but have reduced severity. So
Mm-hmm.
making sure that we're not limiting this to a certain community, in fact, makes it worse for kind of everyone.
Yeah, I hear that.
Yeah.
So you've mentioned isolation. What does safety and prevention really look like right now?
It's difficult to say because I mean it's very difficult to ask somebody to take 2 months off of
Yeah.
whatever they're doing. So I mean, kind of the biggest thing is if you are exposed, number one, go get tested for it. Also, let people know that you were exposed so that they can take precautions. Get vaccinated before exposure if you're able to. If you know that you are going to be around people that have it, or if and not just for people who are sexually active with men, but if you have multiple partners, then this goes with any STI. If you are sexually active with multiple partners, you should take steps to make sure that you're not spreading things between anybody. So it's the idea of transparency with your partners about what you've been exposed to, and making sure that they have access to the vaccine, getting it within that 4-day period if you're not able to get the vaccine beforehand. I think that's kind of the best steps. If you can, if you know you've been exposed, watch your symptoms and watch how you're doing for about 21 days afterwards. I don't know for sure if the guidelines are saying that you need to lock yourself up for those 21 days, or if they're saying that it's probably okay to just monitor yourself and make sure you don't have any lesions that are concerning, or that you're not making excessive contact with people. Just kind of watch it, and then if things progress, then isolate for that next month.
Mm-hmm.
I want to know, like, why monkeypox? Like, where did they come up with monkeypox? Like, I can see like the comparison with like chickenpox, but chickenpox
Mhm.
doesn't actually have anything to do with chickens, right? Does monkeypox have anything to do with monkeys? Do you know anything about how they came up with that?
It's interesting because the initial uh, host of monkeypox, they believe, are rodents in Africa. So not initially monkeys, but humans and monkeys seem to be just kind of incidental hosts that they just kind of came across it and got it. I don't know for sure exactly where monkey came from. I've heard hypotheses about it being something related to racial stigma, but I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole if I don't
Oh,
know for
Sure.
sure. But it's possible that since the origins were likely to be on the African continent, that same thing that we saw with coronavirus, that people had chalked it up to people of certain cultures, unfortunately.
Xenophobia gonna happen.
Yep.
Yeah.
well, that fucking sucks.
Well, you're talking about vaccines. Can you say much at all about the current state of vaccines? I know that there have been a number of reports about shortages, about cutting dosages, and really just a kind of a mediocre organized response in general. I mean, is all of that
Yeah.
accurate as you understand it?
That's it is, as I understand it. I know that they've limited who is eligible for the vaccine, and they have, at least from what I could tell, really only uh, high risk people, namely the gay community, which they have kind of labeled as the primary targets, are able to get this. And we can talk more about that as well. But yeah, I am seeing a lack of availability, and I don't know if the stigma with the gay community is part of why they haven't ramped up their response. But it's definitely, we're definitely not handling this super well.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of rhetoric around that idea. I'm not going to point any fingers or say that any specific government organization, to my knowledge, has meaningfully changed their response because of who's being impacted. But it's definitely sort of an open question, and I know that there are a lot of people that are currently comparing this to the early days of AIDS. That is not a comparison that I think any of us should make casually, but
Yep.
do you find it to be fit at all?
So here's the dilemma that the medical community is facing right now. And it's this balance of stigmatizing a community that already is stigmatized and already at a disadvantage for receiving healthcare. Um, and then the flip side of we have a population that is at risk. So knowing that there are high amounts of people, and whether that's due to certain activity or whether that's due to lack of access to resources, which might be a primary factor, is that people in the LGBTQ community are less likely to have access to care.
Mhm.
But balancing out, like, how much do we prioritize helping a community at risk versus causing them more stigma? And I think a lot of people are worried that, let's say this were to be uh, something similar to the AIDS epidemic, where a primarily LGBTQ community was at risk. If that were to happen, and we were to kill off a high percentage of these people, we can't like sit back and allow that to happen. Like, we
Mhm.
want to intervene and we want to make sure that these people are covered and have access to care and are able to survive. But what does that look like for us as a medical community, with kind of promoting this access to care without labeling this as a gay disease? And I think that's where the debate is right now.
Yeah. Any insights on where that or why cases seem to be centralized around the queer community?
Honestly, I don't have a great answer for that. I can hypothesize that it is largely due to lack of access to care,
Mm,
maybe lack of um, education surrounding how to protect yourself from these kinds of diseases. And like, it's very difficult because you're seeing this with people that touch at all. Um, but when you have certain members of a community that I don't know, they seem to be perceived. They're perceived to be at risk for having multiple partners compared to the cishet population, which we know
sure.
isn't true. We know that anybody can have intercourse with multiple partners, and anyone can be unsafe in their
Yeah.
sexual activity, and that the LGBTQ community isn't by default more risky than someone who is cishet. And I think that's where the disconnect is. So I don't know how much risk is actually different between the communities or how much is a perceived difference. But my guess is, if there is an actual difference, that it's related to access to care.
Sure.
That
I
makes
hear that.
sense. Yes, and apropos of government government institutions needing to be clearer, just lighten this up just a little bit. I was looking up the monkeypox article on the CDC website, and it's describing when it's actually describing the symptoms. It reads as follows: People with monkeypox get a rash that may be located on or near the genitals. Then goes on to clarify penis, testicles, labia, and vagina, or anus, and then in parentheses, butthole. So the CDC felt the need to clarify what an anus is, and
I
the
guess
word they
it's
went
just
with.
good that they're getting the information out there. Secular sexuality can't do all the heavy lifting when it comes to teaching people about their bodies.
This is true. This is true. So I mean, if there's one upside, the word butthole now appears on the official
On a
CDC
formal official
website.
government website. Got it.
Yeah, absolutely. So,